Well, thank you, Mark. It's a delight to be welcomed here, and I've been a huge admirer of the Berkman Center for a long time. This paper, this book, actually originated in a talk I gave at the Berkman Center in August 2013, and I think I can actually remember the day. I think it's August 15 or August 14, 2003, sorry, 2003, a decade ago. You can see which decade I'm living in now. So 2003, August 14th or August 15th, 2003, when the Berkman Center held a little small colloquium retreat over a weekend in Cape Cod with Terry and Jonathan Zittrain presiding, and John Palfrey. So this has deep roots in the Berkman Center. So the internet should herald the greatest free trade zone in history, as well as the greatest free speech zone in history. But only so long as the countries of the world let it. So I want to begin by taking a step back 100 years to a similar moment of globalization, a moment of globalization's promise. This is John Maynard Keynes writing in 1920 about 1914. What an extraordinary episode it was. The inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, and order the contents of the whole earth and expect their early arrival upon his doorstep. This is Amazon's delivery mechanism anticipated 100 years earlier. But of course, we know what happened. We know that the idol was destroyed, that world wars and tariffs and non-tariff barriers between the world wars destroyed this free trade zone and instead moved to immiseration of all countries. For many, many decades, up until the 1960s and 70s, it wasn't even thought that services could be traded. This is what Jagdish Bhagwati calls the haircuts view of services. They had to be provided. Services were like haircuts. You had to deliver them in person. And so this is Keynes's list from his book, 1920 book, of all German exports in 1913, ranging, as you can see, from iron goods to zinc. So literally the kind of the catalog of exports that was possible or expected in 100 years ago. Today, of course, the internet allows us to have services traded across the world. Workers in developing countries are able to participate in lucrative Western markets despite immigration barriers, and Western enterprises are able to offer their service to a global audience, often free of tariffs or local bureaucracy. Technology allows us to jump the Berlin walls that divide the world. So nations from Latin America to Asia now hope to become service suppliers to the world. So the Philippines has displaced India, as you may or may not know, as the world's leading hub for call centers. That may seem just like a technical and abstract development, but it has a crucial effect on people. So over the last generation, as many of you may know, many Filipinos seeking work have migrated overseas. This is leading to what Rachel Pereñas describes as, quote, care chains. So this is where a Filipina woman serves as a nanny for a family overseas and sends money home so she can hire a nanny for her family back home. So today's services in this digital form increase opportunities at home. And here's the remittances versus contact center industry revenues in 1912. So you see that they're almost a third of, they are a third, I should say, of the remittances for, from overseas workers. So the technology makes possible dazzling business models. Take Kazaa here, and many of you are familiar with this. Founded in the Netherlands by a Swede and a Dane, programmed from Estonia, then run from Australia while incorporated in the South Pacific island nation of Vanuatu. Lest you think that this is just the ways of a kind of a site that might be at risk of the law, its founders would follow a similar model in creating Skype, substituting Luxembourg for Vanuatu. So the theory of comparative advantage, of course, where each country benefits by opening up trade, applies to all trade, whether trade in goods or trade in information. Trade may thus appear inevitable, driven by this seemingly inexorable economic logic. But fast forward to the 21st century, the forces of autarky and mercantilism are regrouping, but in a more contemporary guise. In 2004, the government of British Columbia was contemplating outsourcing services to American companies like IBM. The Government Employees Union objected, complaining that this would jeopardize the privacy of Canadians. They cited specifically the USA Patriot Act. The government responded by passing a law barring information from leaving Canada, at least without the consent of the data subject. Consider what this means for the possibility of moving a public university in British Columbia to Gmail. So I know what you're thinking. You just simply have to ask for consent when the person signs up, right? That would be the simple solution to that problem. But the problem is this: if the student sends an email, a Gmail, I should say now, about a fellow citizen, a fellow Canadian, while she's overseas, perhaps, then that information might take a trip across the border. And so she would need consent from the other person as well. Lest you think that this is a radical, crazy, lawyerly hypothetical, this is in fact the interpretation right here from the official interpretation body from just last year. So if the student's next email contained personal information of friends she made during break, the public body would have to get their consent also. Gmail, where you can't actually talk about anyone else. So perhaps you think this is just a foreign problem. In 2005, New Jersey banned the offshoring of government services entirely, even without any provision for consent. The language would seem to prevent Google, which provides services after all, from hosting Gmails for Rutgers University outside the country. So in fact, by the way, if you subscribe to this service, it tells you we may host this outside the country. And so there seems to be a compliance issue, which I raised when I gave this talk at Google a month ago. But there's some irony in all this, which is the fact that Google can't host the information in British Columbia. And of course, this is the inevitable logic of mercantilism at work, where information and services and trade stop at the borders and everyone is made the worse. In 2010, Ohio Governor Ted Strickland prohibited state agencies from outsourcing services to foreign countries. Now just imagine the outcry if he had barred the purchase of foreign goods, right? So perhaps you think this protectionist impulse reflects just a couple of errant states or a couple of errant provinces. But consider this: the US bans online gambling, which, as you know, largely has been the domain of foreign enterprises. A few years ago, the tiny island nation of Antigua challenged the US prohibitions. Here is how tiny it is, by the way. If you can look below, this is the street sign, the highway sign is sponsored by Bodog.com. And so Antigua argued that the US allowed gambling, of course, but only in casinos, and that this operated as a discrimination and a violation of the US market access requirements. The US countered that it was simply trying to address issues like addiction gambling, underage gambling, money laundering, fraud. And the WTO agreed that the United States had violated our commitments, but that the WTO concluded that Antigua hadn't demonstrated that these other public order, public morality goals could be met through alternative means that were reasonably available. Mark has written extensively on this case, and he has the classic piece on article on this case. So many of the barriers to free trade and services, I should say, are a relic of an age of the physical delivery of services. It might be something as benign as the need to visit a licensing office so that you can get a stamp. Now, over millennia, we developed an infrastructure for trade in goods, from customs houses to letters of credit to Incoterms. So we must now develop an infrastructure for international services. This will require what I call dematerialization. So making physical presence unnecessary for authentication, notification, certification, inspection, and even dispute resolution. In the book, I talk about another Berkman Center project, kind of course in Second Life, offered by Berkman Center, with Charlie Nesson transforming from his scooter that he drives up in front of Austin Hall into the virtual figure that enters this Second Life. So that is, of course, dematerialization in a very local way. So dematerialization can make trade in services even more frictionless than trade in goods. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that MOOCs are necessarily going to are definitely part of the future, but they're not a panacea at all. So your smartphone should be and can be an entrepot to history's largest free trade zone. Now, some would go further still and make cyberspace a domain unconstrained by pesky national law. And I'm sure many in this room would prefer that. But a free trade zone in cyberspace should not mean that cyberspace now becomes lawless, or in Johnson & Post terms, the law of the people who enter that zone as contractually determined. So after all, imagine if free trade in goods meant that we had to take in goods under the standards of any foreign country that wanted to export to us. If it meant that a Chinese manufacturer could sell goods under Chinese health and safety standards, or a Dutch merchant could sell, quote, coffee without regard to American regulation. So the other Silk Road in the news this last week makes this quite clear. So I'm not speaking here about the wisdom of any regulation, but just the right of any country to regulate itself and to regulate what happens within its domain through popular sovereignty, of course. So free trade means that a foreign supplier has full and equal access to our market, but must comply with our laws in the process. Such an approach for services might strengthen globalization against a retrenching backlash, and I will talk about this backlash closer to the end of my remarks. If cross-border flows of information undermine our privacy, security, or the standards of locally delivered services, they will not long be tolerated. Even the promise of more efficient production and its concomitant cost savings might not rebuff protectionist impulses bolstered by the emergence of well-publicized examples of abuses abroad. And here again, you can see that I'm hinting at the NSA scandals disclosed recently. So I refer to the process of conforming your service to the local rules as globalization, borrowing a term from sociologists. Now, in cyberspace, having to deal with a regulation from each of the world's 200 countries, not to mention all the federal subdivisions therein, would prove problematic for many service providers. And so there are a variety of important concerns in this context, and I'll just mention one here, the first, balkanization. Excessive assertions of local law may break the web apart. And there have to be, thus, significant limits to globalization to maintain the worldwide nature of the web. First, states must seek to harmonize their rules wherever possible, maintaining heterogeneous rules only when they have done so after due consideration. A good example of this is the move towards internationally accepted accounting standards. Second, states asserting jurisdiction in cyberspace must consider rules of proportionality. So my pithy suggestion, harmonization where possible and globalization where necessary. But how do we convince countries to harmonize their laws? Whose standards should we harmonize to? Will Europe's no data processing without specific consent or America's more laissez-faire attitude towards privacy prevail? In the book, and more specifically in a new paper, one that Mark mentioned this afternoon, How Law Made Silicon Valley, I argue that America's laws proved to be a kind of secret sauce for internet innovation. Specifically, legal innovation in the 1990s reduced liability concerns for internet intermediaries, along with low privacy protections that prevailed, created a legal ecosystem that proved fertile for the new enterprises of what came to be known as Web 2.0. The U.S. largely insulated internet enterprises from liability through, of course, what you are familiar with, CDA Section 230 and the DMCA Title II. Most people focus on 230, but the DMCA Title II has had an incredible positive impact on internet enterprise. Europe, meanwhile, turned up its privacy standards to 11. The European Privacy Directive was issued in 1995, a reference that very few people will get, except for maybe Bruce and Terry, largely to address the rise of the internet. So where the U.S. had approached the internet out of hope, and for its ability to connect the world, much of the rest of the world met the internet with fear for its negative consequences. So let me give you a couple of examples of the differences in US law and law elsewhere. Could Google have been founded in London? So Prime Minister David Cameron says that Larry and Sergey told him no. This is not due to the lack of brilliant engineers in the UK or the lack of finance in the city of London. Cameron explains that Google's founders told him that Google services depend upon taking a snapshot of the whole internet at any one time, and that that's not possible under UK copyright law. So he explained with apparent envy, over there they have what are called fair use provisions, which give some people breathing space, which gives companies breathing space for innovation. So in the US, let me turn to a different country. Sean Fanning, the young inventor of Napster, becomes a celebrated billionaire. His multi-million-dollar wedding, the stuff of extensive coverage. The Japanese Sean Fanning, by contrast, spent a decade battling the law. In 2002, Isamu Kaneko, a researcher at the University of Tokyo, distributed a file-sharing program he wrote called Winnie. 2 years later, he was arrested because he continued to distribute the program despite the fact that he was aware that some people used it to commit copyright infringement. Imagine that same standard being applied to Apple iPods, for example. So after his arrest, Kaneko, who had taught a series of lectures to nurture super programmers, resigned his position. In 2006, the Tokyo court found him guilty, decrying his, quote, selfish and irresponsible attitude. Even then, the judge conceded that Kaneko did not specifically intend to cause copyright violation. He kept on fighting. He was finally cleared by the Japanese Supreme Court in 2011. And so the story, of course, has a tragic ending. Kaneko died earlier this month at the age of 42 of a heart attack. Kaneko began his life, began the 21st century, I should say, with the promise of a Japanese Sean Fanning, but his story ends with the tragedy of a Japanese Aaron Swartz. So any discussion of Silk Roads, new or old, must include China. And here there's a significant puzzle. Inside the Great Firewall of China, there's a dazzling array of internet enterprise, right? Yet China, the world champion of outsourcing of goods, has failed to transfer its success into services. China may be the world's factory floor, but India stands poised to become the world's back office, and Silicon Valley remains its information intermediary. And while these companies are worth billions, most of them don't even bother to offer a website in any language other than Chinese, and perhaps Korean for North Korea. So when listing their stock in the New York exchanges, they evince an ambition to conquer only China, not the world. Baidu tells us it's the leading Chinese language internet search provider. Google, by contrast, here's Google's bold and largely accurate declaration. It's a global technology leader that improves the lives of billions of people globally. So, of course, there's one obvious answer. The Chinese company are merely copycats, replicating American internet services. So, of course, there's an element of truth in that explanation, but as any reflection on that would indicate that it's incomplete. Silicon Valley is, of course, not immune to copying. And in fact, informal knowledge transfer is often touted as the key to its success. Facebook, for example, was hardly the world's first social network. As many of you will know, Friendster, MySpace, even Korea's Cyworld predate Facebook. So let me suggest two additional reasons. First, protectionism doesn't often build companies ready for the world. Second, and I think more important, those outside China are likely to be less than keen to transfer personal data for processing to a country with few restraints on governmental snooping. Unlike goods, services involve sensitive data, information about people and businesses that can be shared or used without a person's knowledge. So the argument in my book is that the Great Firewall of China not only keeps US companies out of China, it keeps Chinese companies in. So this latter claim about data insecurity, which I make about the book, is now, of course, being made about the United States. So European officials are warning that Europeans may stop using American companies that process data. So this is Neelie Kroes, the European Commissioner for Digital Matters. So after the disclosures of NSA spying, President Obama sought to comfort the American people. He said, with respect to the internet and emails, this does not apply to US citizens, and it does not apply to people living in the United States. By the way, you can see his constitutional law professor roots in that sentence, because he's giving you the Fourth Amendment standard as it's currently understood by the courts. So it's just not American citizens, it's also U.S. residents, right? So it's U.S. Citizens abroad as well. So it's formulated very precisely, okay? So he knows what he's doing. But reflect for a moment what this says by implication for people abroad. Can we treat them as potential terrorists simply because they aren't American? Just because you're foreign shouldn't mean you're suspect. So we need to ensure that the world feels that when they trust their personal information to us, their searches, their likes, their pictures, their words, we will be responsible custodians. At the moment, we seem to be suggesting the opposite. So I want to return to the British Columbia Government Employees Union of 2004 and look at what they said in 2004. The U.S. has made it clear that in matters of state security, the civil rights of its own citizens will be substantially discounted, and those of non-citizens effectively ignored, right? That seems to be hinted at a little bit, at least the latter part of it, in President Obama's statement. So there is a huge risk here to Silicon Valley. Will Germans, Brazilians, or Chinese write emails using Microsoft's Outlook or Google's Gmail if they think that those companies are essentially CIA spies? The companies are rapidly working, of course, to try to disprove that notion. But at the same time, we should be cautious that legitimate concerns, so I think those are very legitimate concerns indeed. Legitimate concerns about privacy and security, however, don't mask protections for local industry. Viviane Reding, the European Commissioner for European Commission's Justice Minister, revealed that she wanted to see the development of European clouds. Okay. There's some ambiguity as to exactly what that means. So, but there's a worry here that this is really a mask for seeking to prefer European companies over American ones. Le Monde revealed that France had a similar surveillance program, that Germany is a prolific partner in NSA surveillance. So I think it's worthwhile for us to keep in mind the question, is this data protection or is it data protectionism? By the way, Mark said sometimes Prezi makes you dizzy, and I'm actually starting to feel that way from watching this. So we are seeing the emergence of a halal internet, a BRICS internet, and a Euro cloud, which this is a threat that will break apart the World Wide Web, much as the trade barriers that Keynes decried between the wars. So let me conclude. For the bulk of human history, geography was destiny. The opportunity to participate in global trade makes our fate less circumscribed to the land in which we were born. At the same time, the World Wide Web binds our fates more closely together, making possible both commerce and other interaction across humanity itself. And I notice that the Berkman Center is not following me, so I'm just making sure that that's corrected.
Thank you very much, Anupam. And I'll open the floor up for questions. And again, if when you're asking questions, you could identify yourself.
Okay. Yep. I'm going to start by challenging some of what you said, just to see what kind of response you get. Let's take the example of the Ohio government that wants to keep its information services inside Ohio. The Ohio government being elected by the people of Ohio to serve the interests of the people of Ohio, when they have a legitimate interest in trying to keep that work among the citizens of Ohio whenever possible.
Right.
What's wrong with this picture?
Well, it's a picture that, of course, contrasts with notions of free trade and the virtues of free trade, right? So that is the kind of mercantilist impulse, which is we can export stuff from Ohio to the world, and we want to push exports, but we want to stop imports, right? You'll never send anything to us. We will only buy from fellow.
This is only about the procurement of services for the state government. This wasn't saying, if I'm resident of Ohio, I can't buy something from Illinois.
Sure. Of course, it's state government services, and it's actually not limiting to purchases only within Ohio. It's within the United States, period. So the question, but government procurement is simply is one large. I mean, it's not highly liberalized as it should be in international trade law, and of course, as Mark will tell you, governments try to keep their ability to prefer local procurement as much as possible, but everyone recognizes that what's sensible for a consumer is also sensible for a government in the ability to purchase goods and services from anywhere. So imagine if it had done the same thing for goods, okay, buying only goods from the United States. It would have, of course, meant that it would be paying more typically, and often sometimes getting less value. And finally, sometimes you can't even get the good from any other source outside the United States. So this is true of services as well. The services providers, like IBM, like Amazon, etc., like the Bangalore industries or the call center industries in the Philippines, are providing services that are globally competitive, and so there's the economies of scale, obviously, that arises from that, but not just the economies of scale, the expertise that develops as you fragment this supply chain. Is really quite amazing. So my book has a substantial discussion of this make or buy decision. In fact, efficient production is all about, if the technology is allowed, turning to the markets rather than turning to internal command hierarchies. And those, of course, are those market-based mechanisms are improved the bigger the markets are, the bigger the base from which you can buy or sell your goods or services. So it's a great question. Governments can be protectionist, but it ultimately harms them. It harms their people. It harms the governments, and of course, what happens, as I suggested in the. They would say that they're seeding a local industry, but then what happens is that you're going to see a backlash ultimately, so that Google and Facebook will no longer be welcome in foreign countries, right? And so Google earns half its income overseas. Twitter earns a third of its income overseas, so it's actually less global, and not in use, but in income than Facebook or Google, which are both half. And they expect to earn more and more of their income overseas. So these companies, Silicon Valley needs us not to be protectionist, because otherwise everyone else will be protectionist against Silicon Valley. And so I used here intentionally a service called Prezi, which is run out of Eastern Europe, which I can't actually recommend, unfortunately, but after my experiences with it and its dizzyfying nature. It is important for us to be able to access and the world's services. So to have a competitor to Microsoft, for example, for this service, or even Apple for this service, or I guess Google Docs, which is a poor competitor to this service. Fight for the future.
Yeah. So it seems like the issue is that there's a certain class of services that are sort of end-to-end in the sense that they have a direct relationship with the end user. So back office work isn't really that, but Google is. And in any case like that, I mean, I can't even see a local regulation that says, this government isn't going to use Google working to some extent, because it'll hit some point where, if that service is just that much compellingly better, people will start to say, well, why are we using this dumb webmail service that's broken all the time, and when all the other governments are just using Google apps. So that the power of sophisticated online enterprises that deal directly with users to shortcut local regulation seems almost absolute, up to the point where their website gets blocked, and that seems really unlikely. I mean, even if what's the EU going to do against Gmail? So it seems like the space is going to get defined more by the power relationships between countries, the extent to which the power relationships between large companies in their home country, and the extent to which a country creates a friendly environment for the world's largest companies, both in terms of education and investment law and legal protections.
So that's a wonderful story of consumer empowerment. If we don't like a rule, I don't think it's accurate much of the time, unfortunately. So I bet you to this day you don't have any British Columbia public universities using Gmail, right? Not because Gmail isn't going to be better than the alternatives that they offer. At UC Davis, our general system, we have switched over to Gmail finally, but our systems were not good. I use horrible platform for reaching my students, and I wish that I could use a better platform, but it would take. It's already integrated with our registrar, and so I know exactly. I'm sorry.
Your students probably just use Gmail and just set up a forward or something like that in most cases.
No, but it's a platform for course materials and other communications. So yes, they're going to get their stuff through Gmail or Yahoo or some other web-based service. That's certainly true. But I think these decisions are often made by bureaucrats who are often insulated from the actual cost of the decisions. And so the law matters tremendously. The pressure on bureaucrats, the pressure from the European Commission, move towards a Euro cloud, is a very strong one. And you see again and again over the course of this year statements from the European commissioners saying, we don't trust American services. And so if you're a European company thinking about what your options are, should you use Amazon's cloud computing service? And so those are, so you're saying those are back-end services, and they are back-end services. So Google is also providing a lot of business services. So not just directly, we experience Google as a, direct consumer service, but it's providing a lot more and hopes to provide a lot more business services. Google Apps is hopes to be the kind of framework. All these companies want to be your virtual office, right? So everything you can do here, you can just do here on a laptop at Starbucks, right? Terry.
So, Anupam, as usual, it's a wonderfully interesting set of materials. I would be curious if you'd be willing to reconsider some of the arguments you've offered in this distilled version here, explicitly from the standpoint of a progressive political agenda. So it seems that one of the drivers of your recommendations is recognition of the progressive redistribution of wealth that can be achieved through dispersion of services. So that classic examples will be the variety of information-based services coming out of Southeast Asia provided to developing countries now as one of the avenues to upward mobility in those regions. So there is a progressive component to the partial harmonization and opening that's essential to your argument. But there are also progressives, not just, in fact, probably not primarily in the United States, who resist the overall enterprise on a variety of grounds. And most of these have arisen in the context of goods, but conceivably are applicable to services as well. So just to tick off a few, one is a general suspicion of the homogenization of global culture and the corrosion of local identity. Number two would be environmental threats. Now, this is most prominent in the context of advocacy of local sourcing of food and hostility to global transactions in food. Maybe services are less relevant here, but maybe not. Okay. The third example would be the theme that you and Madhavi have pursued, namely opportunities for disadvantaged or indigenous groups in the developing world to capitalize upon traditional forms of knowledge, which tend to be geographically grounded, to leverage economic power in the present. She offers many
the last sentence, I'm sorry.
The ability of, this is your own argument.
Yes, okay, yeah.
The ability of disadvantaged, historically disadvantaged, often indigenous groups in the developing world to capitalize upon local cultural heritage to recover some portion of the profits that the developed world have been able to reap from them for centuries. And the last one is more European in character, is another hazard of homogenization is that it corrodes the capacity of countries that have witnessed horrific forms of genocide or exploitation to impose controls that would reduce the likelihood in much of Europe of a neo-fascist revival.
Right, right.
So those would be all, as I say, viewing these considerations from the standpoint of a progressive political agenda. Aren't there things we should be worried about here?
So I see the book as progressive in exactly those ways. So let me explain why on all those fronts. So I think the pure cyber libertarian approach is to say people can opt into whatever set of rules they want. So take, for example, the Yahoo Nazi memorabilia issue. Yahoo and the consumer sitting in France should be able to choose the law of whatever state they want, and the French consumer of this material saying, I'm choosing California law to govern this transaction, and therefore opting out of the local rules. And I think, in fact, that this idea of globalization, which I borrow exactly from sociologists who are concerned about that homogenization, the homogenizing effect of global culture, the kind of flattening of local difference. So I say, no, of course, popular sovereignty means the right of countries to be able to create their own rules. Now, I temper that with a worry about protectionism. So, yes, you can do it. You can create your own rules. But if it's just a subterfuge for local protectionism, then it's a problem. If this is just a way to prop up a local alternative, then I've got a problem with that, because it's actually harming everyone, as Keynes would have said in 1920. So I think there's concern about that. Now, you're speaking of the long history and the culturally specific nature of rules. I want to give you another example besides the Yahoo one. Google Ads, for a while at least, and Facebook too, allowed in India searches to have ads next to them, which would be advertising for sex selections, abortions. Okay, so basically they would help identify the gender of the fetus, and then could lead to the abortion of that fetus. India, roundly complained to Google and Facebook, and Google and Facebook desisted. So you can have those kinds of ads in the United States, but you can't have them in India. It's a very culturally specific thing, and it's important that the Indian government has that kind of control. So in other words, we don't, again, want to make the internet a free speech zone in the sense that all speech goes without any kind of local constraint. That's not what I'm saying. In fact, you might be able to say pro-Nazi speech might be unacceptable. Some countries, lots of countries, have rules about denigrating religion. I live in the United States. I tend to favor our rules, but I'm not speaking to the wisdom of any other country's rules. And I think it's important for countries to have the ability to do that. So I think, in fact, my effort is trying to bridge that kind of progressive. So Mike Moore spoke on this book yesterday, and he described himself as a free trade social democrat.
This is Mike Moore, the former head of the WTO, not Mike Moore, the director. So just making sure to make that point.
Free trade social democrat is so not.
Just making sure. Sorry, Anupam.
Yes, thank you. He's also the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, so he's a Kiwi, I guess. Though he didn't call himself that. I don't know if they actually do call themselves that. I'm sorry?
When I was there last.
Oh, okay, all right. Okay, good. And so I think that's the kind of the spirit of this work. With respect to the environment, I actually think that there are strong environmental reasons to want this kind of international trade and services. one, as you know, providing trade-owned services kind of helps consumers, but more importantly, might, so one of the big drivers of energy use increases in the world is servers, right? So server farms are very, kind of energy intensive. And so what companies like Facebook and Google have done, and I don't know if you saw this story, some of you may have seen the story in the weekend New York Times again, about Facebook placing servers near the Arctic Circle. Because they can take advantage, so that one of the reasons you need energy is to keep them cool, to keep everything from overheating. So Facebook now just has bare motherboards, basically, just running very hot, like 85 degrees or something like that, but cooling them through the frigid Arctic air. And so if you had localization requirements, which are again and again being mooted across the world, where you can't store services outside my country, that means you're going to have servers in lots of places where the energy is not going to be very green. And so I think there is a strong future environmental impact at issue that we need to be concerned with.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. That was terrific. I have a question kind of going back to the Silk Road idea, and it's kind of the non-progressive agenda, the commercial agenda. Silk Road was a commercial enterprise or a commercial supply chain, right? So one of the things I'm interested in is the harmonization idea. You know, the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, creates nation states. So we have local law. The laws of physics that the internet was built on are not local, they're universal. So that's why we have this universal system, buildable, interoperable universally. But we have local laws which gum up the works from the commercial perspective. So one of the things I'm wondering is, in the harmonization idea, we have these two ways to have duties to evoke harmonized behaviors commercially and otherwise and socially. Duties can come from contract or legislation. Now we can't have legislation in this country anymore until legislators meet again. So we may have legislation in the future. This may become a necessity, not just an option. But seriously, if we look at, I'm interested in the role of contract, and in particular in contract in new space and new value propositions, so that it's not in the existing legislative space. So if you talk to Vivian or Nellie in the EU, they're looking at some artifactual paradigms, right? So what I'm wondering is just some of your comments on the role of contract in helping to achieve the harmonization that here might help with some of the issues raised.
So let's talk about privacy. So the United States is hoping for a kind of a global kind of dialogue, a multi-stakeholder dialogue convened by the U.S. government, of all things, and then enforced by the U.S. government. So a very interesting set of kind of a hybrid model where the private and governmental entities, including ones from around the world, collaborate on a certain set of industry-specific privacy rules, and then the Federal Trade Commission enforces those rules, at least enforces deviations from them with its small sanctioning power, right? And so it's the kind of hybrid model. It's the kind of, not exactly contractual, because once the hope of the Obama administration now is that they actually become legally, not just contractually binding, but actually potentially legally binding within that industry, even on parties that haven't contracted into that regime. And so that's one approach. Of course, the European approach is a very strong privacy regime that really safeguards data across the world, of Europeans as it travels across the world. I tend to feel that the European approach is dangerous to innovation, and so in the book and in the paper, How Law Made Silicon Valley, I argue that it's been a substantial problem for European companies. You haven't seen, the rise of these immense European companies in this space. Not, I think, because of lack, as I said, lack of capital or lack of brilliant engineers, but because of these privacy rules that and the IP rules that kind of stultify innovation. Because so if you look at, so I know that many of you will be alarmed by this. Imagine this. So you can now see what is the most highlighted portions of a Kindle ebook. Okay. Which could be very useful. I'd love to have, Mark's text, new text, and see what my students are highlighting. Maybe not individually identifiable, perhaps, but I'd love to see, you can imagine all kinds of things that we might learn from what they're doing. But I don't think that Amazon, when it started doing this, even knew that it was going to happen. Okay, so when Amazon started collecting that information, it didn't expect to. Maybe some visionary engineer saw the use a couple, 5 years later of that highlighting. But when they realized what kind of data they were getting, they realized that they had something valuable. So this is the kind of innovation that becomes possible in a world of largely contractually supplied privacy, which is a world largely devoid of privacy, by the way. So I'm not arguing for a world devoid of privacy. I actually think that, but I think that the European model goes too far towards stultifying it. So this is a controversial claim, and I know that many of you will be alarmed.
Just as follow-up, yeah. One of the things that was interesting, and I hadn't learned this until recently, is that the Chinese, Korean, and Japanese law are based on German law in the IP area. Property, I hadn't known that. And the IP law in Europe, as you know, is based on kind of a Hegelian and Kantian notion. This, the morale notions and non-alienability kind of notions. And we have a Lockean kind of notion, UK and US, that laissez-faire kind of approach. So it's a very generalizing here, of course. But the import of those German concepts into Asia is becoming very interesting because it's not, there's a mimicry that's going on, as you alluded to, in China with regard to IP. And one of the things I think will be interesting is how the European privacy iteration of that philosophical construct will iterate itself in Asia. Because you have Confucianism there as well as a philosophical construct that informs elements of that society. And that group individual relationship bears upon, obviously, privacy, as you alluded to, but also just generally those commercial relationships, where the efficacy will lie.
So, of course, as you know, I can't leave the claim that our system is Lockean. Feist would, of course, militate against that. I know my colleague Rob Mergis would probably support the return to that kind of vision, but that's not, I don't think, the way that American law currently stands. Now, mind you, I do think that there's a lot of kind of moral rights impulses even in the United States law. There's and a lot of Lockean impulses. So it's all more complicated and more of a jumble. If you ask a legislator what he or she is doing and why he or she is doing it, I don't think they're going to give you the law and economics version of the story. Yes.
You're saying that the privacy laws I'm not sure if that's the real reason why. If I look to the Netherlands, right?
Could you remind me where you are again? You said you were a professor. I apologize. I didn't catch where you were.
I'm associate professor at the University of Aruba.
Aruba?
Aruba, yes.
Aruba.
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay.
Visiting.
Well, this is and do they take visiting professors?
That's maybe for after. No, so
I have you on record here, by the way.
The innovation thing. I'm originally from the Netherlands, and if I look back at the way things developed in the Netherlands, we used to have this thing called Hives, which was Facebook before Facebook. Why did Hives fail in the Netherlands? Because they had like 100% market share at one point. I guess mostly because they weren't international. It was a Dutch website. So if you would, find someone outside of, you couldn't find them on Hives. So, gradually they got pushed out because they didn't have the same worldwide setup as Facebook did. eBay, for instance, we had this site, we still have this site in the Netherlands called the Dutch Marketplace, and it was bought by eBay because it was already fully functioning, and eBay couldn't get penetration. So then I'm like, okay, even though we have more stringent privacy rules, some of the same things developed, and for different reasons, maybe failed or stayed.
So. Mark alluded to my paper, Facebookistan, which a version of which appears in this book. So I reviewed all the contests that Facebook has had with the law around the world that were published at the time. And I really think that Facebook could take advantage of the lack of U.S. privacy protections by repeatedly innovating new ways to use information. So some of you're all familiar with Moore's law, but you may not have heard of Zuckerberg's law. Zuckerberg's law says that every year the amount of information shared will double. Okay. I'm not kidding you. This is Zuckerberg's law, as he states it, and Facebook, in fact, kind of epitomizes that. And if you follow the history of Facebook, everything they do is followed by an international outcry about their erosion of privacy. Okay, and you know what? They fiddle with it a tiny bit, and they do it anyway. Okay, and so there are slight exceptions to that rule, but their ability to innovate about the sharing of information has made it hard for other services. You're right that the Dutch people want to communicate with not just with Dutch people, so they need a global service. But why wasn't Hives the global service is the question, right? Dutch people certainly speak English, are the most bilingual people in the world, some of the most bilingual people in the world, right? And so they speak multiple languages, and so they could have been the next, what we think of as the Facebook, right? And so this has been a tremendous problem. I do argue this risk for companies like Baidu and the social networks within China, that once they are actually exposed to real competition, they will face this kind of fear. And one of the claims in the book is that the fact that China didn't have extensive privacy protections and extensive IP protections worked in favor of Chinese internet enterprise. So there's a really interesting story about Baidu. A lot of the searches are MP3, as Terry well knows. Terry knows the Chinese MP3 market really well. So a lot of the searches are for MP3s, etc. So that helped their growth tremendously.
So I want to ask a question just to get a sense, having read the book, of how much you think this time is different, right? Because every time we get a new technological innovation, in some ways, right, the Silk Road that you alluded to is just moving into cyberspace. So two questions along those lines. One on filtering, right? If you think of the old Silk Road, if there had been a town on that Silk Road, now towns were free to do whatever they wanted to do, but if there had been a town that was going to inspect every single shipment and then set certain ones aside and really check through all this, right? Eventually the traders would just decide to bypass this town and move on to the next town. This town couldn't get away with doing this, and so on and so forth. So my first question is, how much do you think that's also true with respect to what we think of as the new version of this on this new Silk Road, right? Electronic filtering and going through and having those types of controls. And are you a determinist enough to think that societies who do so will either be forced to loosen up or face economic peril? So that's the first question. The second question is, even if you think about the old roads, there are certain types of services that countries, for whatever reason, oftentimes they say national security, have just not wanted to globalize, right? So think about railroads, right, one of those. Postal delivery, right? Even though it would be much more efficient for countries to merge their postal systems together, countries still want to have their own postal delivery systems. On the other hand, things like airlines, right? Over the last 20, 30 years, at first everyone wanted their own national carrier. Now people are fine with mergers or even X taking over Alitalia and so on and so forth. So do you see an internet version of what would be, say, postal delivery services or these kind of core services that countries very rightly would want to retain some form of a national mode of delivery for?
It's a great question. So in my, so there's something funny about the title because I'm saying something, this is like something that was before, but I'm also saying that this is totally new. So I'm doing both at the same time. And I think, I would say that it's like before and still new. So it's hard, whether that's reconcilable or irreconcilable, I'm not sure. But I do believe that there are important things that are different. And let me give you an example. So you talked about countries that are doing filtering. And we had this amazing example this last week. So the Israeli leader gets on BBC Persia and says, using old technologies largely, but also the internet technologies that allow that information to spread, he says the Iranians need to be able to use Western services, internet services. They need to be able to. They should be able to wear blue jeans and listen to pop music. And of course, what happened? And he says at the same time, the tragic thing. He says, he watched Neda Aga Sultan die using these new services, right? Well, it turns out, of course, as the Iranians pointed out to him using Twitter, that Neda Aga Sultan was wearing blue jeans, and when she died. Then the Iranians also, the young people of Iran, the New York Times actually tells us, wear blue jeans at the same rate as Americans, apparently. They all, tweeted images of themselves wearing blue jeans and listening to Western pop music. And that's a country that, of course, tries to do that filter, tries to have that halal internet, et cetera. You saw also this last, it was actually probably a little bit more than last week, one of Twitter's founders, Jack Dorsey, tweeted to Rouhani because the new leader of Iran has his own Twitter feed. He said, are the people of Iran going to be able to access this information? And the president tweets back, I'm working to make sure that Iranians can access all the advantages of technology, basically. So non-committal, but at least a conversation in a very interesting way. So it seems different. How often, when General Motors went into Iran, did its CEO or founders, speak to the kind of speech and politics of the country? They typically just worried about whether or not their factories could be built, whether they had they could get their stuff on the roads. Trade protectionism, not the stuff that Silicon Valley worries about. Why is Silicon Valley worried? Because Twitter wants more markets, and speech and market share are the same. That's the true for Silicon Valley, right? Silicon Valley is information intermediaries, and so they have a tremendous investment in free speech. The more free speech, the better off they are, and so they become, by virtue of their own kind of economic structure and their own ideologies, very strong free speech activists across the world. And Twitter, I think, is the new zone for speech. And so, and I keep this. The cover of my book is, and I don't know if this is obvious, but if you look at the cover right here, this is tweets and retweets. Tweets that this is a map generated using the nodes of the location identifiers of people actually within the tweet. So the person who does the tweet and someone referenced within the tweet. And then there's a retweet. And you can see that these tweets and retweets are occurring across the world, that people are talking to each other. Okay, that's the what it also shows, and I learned this before. The New York Times actually revealed this with this last week. It turns, if you look at this map closely, it turns, there's a blinding light in the Pacific Ocean, and it turns out to be Indonesia. So it turns out that Indonesians are the heaviest tweeters in the world for some interesting reason. Apparently, they may be very talkative. I don't know. People could opine on that cultural phenomenon. I also, as I said, I had the Prime Minister of New Zealand talking about this yesterday, my book yesterday. He had one complaint, which is that my cover, and this isn't my fault, so I felt kind of embarrassed, but yeah. So I think that it's different. I think filtration is possible. It's imperfect. I don't think it's futile. So I'm not one of these people who thinks that the net sees censorship as damage and routes around it. Right? This is the statement that's made. You can stop the net. It's possible, and it has huge consequences. But there are very few countries in the world that have really gone off the grid, and this is true certainly not of China. China still, you can get through to Google through the Hong Kong service in China, even though China could have banned Google entirely, even the Hong Kong gateways, right? But it's true largely in North Korea, and so there are very few places where the internet hasn't had substantial reach.
I have questions about the how would you classify there are a lot of online service into the current regime of the WTO. The trade lawyer Simon Lester just raised questions on the World Trade Net yesterday, asking. He asked, there are a lot of online services. Actually, they are only provided for educational purpose, or they are provided for free. So he was wondering, to what extent can we still treat it like trade in service, and how would you classify then this kind of service under the W120 list?
So I am quite familiar with this. So this was an issue raised at the WTO Public Forum this last week. What exactly is this information service? What exactly is Wikipedia, et cetera? Is it traded? Does it make sense? I have to say, it took me a long while to understand that Google was a service. I mean, I know it seems obvious when you say it, but it took me a long while. I didn't begin writing about Google in this paper, and what became this book. When I gave this talk in 2003, I was talking about network. I wasn't talking about Google, and it took me a long while to recognize it. But I think, and I've read the WorldTradeLaw.net, Simon Lester's report on this question. And I agree with Simon that in fact the word services is so broad in GATS, in the General Agreement on Trade and Services, that it does not require a commercial component to be a service. Now that said, I don't think it's really that important, because I don't see governments making claims on behalf of non-commercial services. So this is I would love to see, the U.S. government making a claim on behalf of Wikipedia. It might, but only in conjunction with a claim on behalf of Google. And so, this takes a lot of money to create, to do these cases. And if there isn't a huge commercial interest, there's less likely to have the governmental interest in following up on it. So I do think that the non-commercial services would be covered under the GATS trade obligations. Whether that's practically relevant in terms of bringing a claim, I don't know, except that the claim would be brought on behalf of a number of services, including a non-commercial service.
So we have time for one last pitching question, if anyone has it.
Do you think that the world governments all these different governments are ready to harmonize with the constituency? Not, there's a big problem right now with digital illiteracy, right? A lot of people don't understand how the internet works, how caching works, how the different methods to get information at the right place works. So are we even prepared to harmonize, or is there, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think the future is in harmonization. It's going to be so hard not to harmonize, to create where, like international standards bodies for lots of different things, for security professionals, for architectural services, for maybe even lawyers. And so, these kinds of things are going to happen. That's the future. When I talked about this a long time ago with Bruce Ackerman, he was disappointed ultimately in my approach because he favored his view was, why not just move towards world governance, right? And harmonization is world governance, right? And so there's something, there's a very important thing that is happening in the moment. We're living through a moment where nation states are crucial and they're important for consumer protection and for popular sovereignty. But ultimately, the internet is bringing us all closer together. And this tweeting and retweeting heralds a world where nation-state borders cannot be maintained forever.
So that signal here, very important.
I wanted to ask you, we actually are working with the University of Indonesia now. They're writing a comprehensive cyber legislation, e-sign, privacy, the whole schmear. What resources? They want to harmonize, and they want to talk to people in the U.S. government. That's a hell of a place to start, but let's go with that. What resources shall we direct them to, in addition to talking to the governments? Because I wanted them to talk to you would be a nice thing for starters. But are there other resources out there besides the existing resources that we might direct them to?
So I'd recommend this book.
Yeah, that was
and so, but I have a number of papers. The How Law Made Silicon Valley paper, I just, for whatever reason, I always forget to actually post it on SSRN, but it will go on SSRN. It's coming out in a couple of months in Emory Law Review, and that's, I think, an important paper. UNCITRAL, of course, is the kind of principal place where this kind of stuff is happening, the work program is happening. But the worry on this kind of international front is a kind of overzealous view that IP equals innovation. And so when developing countries look outside, the Western mantra has been IP equals innovation, and I don't believe that's the case. I think IP is important for innovation. I'm not saying that we should go to a no IP regime, but that breathing space is crucial. And the breathing space exists in U.S. law. Everyone thinks of U.S. law as being maximalist, and I think U.S. law is very excessive in a lot of ways. But as you can see, we have a huge tumult of very prosperous internet enterprise that grew up in the shadow of this IP regime. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Anupam.